Hello and welcome to the Dublin's Water Heritage Lecture Series, which is organised by Dublin City Council in partnership with the Local Authority Waters Programme, LAWPRO. This series explores the archaeological, natural, cultural, social and historical importance of Dublin's water heritage. My name is Dr. Ruth Johnson and I'm City Archaeologist with Dublin City Council. It's my great pleasure today to host the talk, the third in the series, which is by Professor Howard Clarke. Howard's talk is called The Lifeblood of Medieval Dublin, the Liffey and its Tributaries. It tells a story from a major ford across the River Liffey to a pool for Viking warships in the River Poddle, to a bridge across the main river, and eventually to port facilities at Wood Quay and elsewhere. Now, Howard B. Clarke is a member of the Royal Irish Academy and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He's formerly of the School of History, now the School of History and Archives in University College Dublin. Howard continues to work on the history of medieval Dublin, on the Irish Historic Towns Atlas, on Evesham Abbey and its cartularies, and on the Bayeux Tapestry and the Domesday Book. His most recent publications are The Vikings in Ireland and Beyond, edited with myself, and Lords and Towns in Medieval Europe, edited with Angret Sims. Howard's doctoral thesis was focused on aspects of the governance of England prior to the accession of King John in 1199. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand you over to Howard. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. This talk is based largely on my contribution to the Irish Historic Towns Atlas, which I shall call the IHTA, a long-term project of the Royal Irish Academy. It began publication in 1986, and to date, 27 Irish towns and cities, north and south, feature in it. Belfast is in 2 parts, and Dublin in 3 of 4 parts. In addition, there are pocket maps of some of the bigger towns and a number of ancillary volumes. The IHTA is part of a European project sponsored by the International Commission for the History of Towns, which I shall call the ICHT. To date, around 550 towns and cities have been treated in this way across 19 countries. As it happens, the ICHT is having its annual conference this year in Ireland, meeting in Dublin, Maynooth and Derry. The conference theme is Crisis in Urban Order. The first Dublin fascicle, we call them fascicles because they're made up of loose leaves for the maps. The first Dublin fascicle, whose front cover you can see here, is now 20 years old and somewhat out of date, especially archaeologically. For new material, see especially the Medieval Dublin series, edited by Professor Sean Duffy, Trinity College Dublin, sponsored by Dublin City Council, and published by the Four Courts Press. Nevertheless, much of what follows can be found in this fascicle, including most of the illustrations. Starting with the essay head image. This ink wash and watercolor view of Dublin from the Phoenix Park was made by Francis Place in about 1698. It shows Kilmainham Bridge in the foreground, the predecessor of Sarah Bridge on South Circular Road. The Liffey's width and meanders seem to be exaggerated, but create an impression of the river as the city's lifeblood. The essay in the IHTA fascicle contains a number of text maps at strategic dates, starting with about 840 AD, on the eve of the establishment of a Viking settlement. The principal river was then known as the Rohre, containing the idea of rushing water and probably reflecting the river's tendency to produce flash floods caused by heavy rain in the mountains. The earliest 10th century embankments at Wood Quay were interpreted as flood banks. Liffey, spelt L-I-P-H-E, was the name of the plain in County Kildare through which it flows, and this name was transferred to the river itself in the early Middle Ages. At high tide, the river was about 300 meters wide, entering Dublin Bay east of present-day Gretton Bridge. Usher's Island survived as such until the 17th century. Some of you may know Ireland Street and Usher's Quay. The principal ford across the lowest feasible crossing point at low tide may have taken advantage of shallows due east of this island. According to a 9th century text, it was one of the 3 great fords in Ireland, the 2 others being across the River Shannon and non-tidal. It gave rise to the oldest settlement in the ancient core of Dublin, Clarke, meaning ford of hurdlework, situated on the ridge top south of the ford, as you can see on the map. The word clear represents rafts laid on the mudflats on both sides of the main stream. These were presumably weighted down so as to create a relatively stable crossing point for both humans and animals at low tide. An incident recorded in 770 AD tells how a number of aggressors from the Boyne Valley area, having looted in Leinster, were drowned in the full tide on their way back home. Clarke remains the preferred form of the city's Irish name on road signs throughout the country. The Baile prefix is not recorded until 1368, sending or into the genitive case to make the name Baile Clarke. Also tidal was the River Puddle as far as an island near present-day St. Patrick's Cathedral, and a spot known even in the late 18th century as Cross Puddle. A vital feature was a tidal pool regarded as black on account of peaty soil conditions on the site of the Dublin Garden south of the castle. This black pool gave rise to the name of an early monastery defined by an enclosing bank and ditch in the Angel Street area, as you can see there. Since both the Liffey and the Puddle were tidal rivers and therefore salty, fresh drinking water would have been accessible in the commons water flowing along the Coombe. The name Coombe means valley, as well as other small rivers and local wells. The name commons water is suggestive of public access for everyone. Fetching water in the Middle Ages was usually an aspect of women's work. When Viking Dublin was besieged by the High King in 989, the inhabitants are said to have surrendered on account of having to drink salt water. Presumably the Irish army had cut off the supply. Another fording place across the Liffey was upstream at the ford or fords of Kilmahavok, named after Saint Muhammad and a nearby church. This took advantage of a string of small islands west of South Circular Road. Parallel to the Liffey was the River Cammack, on which the village of Kilmainham was situated. The rising ground between the Cammack and the alluvial plain of the Liffey would become the site of Kilmainham Priory, the headquarters of the Knights Hospitaller in Ireland. And I should add here that soon you will be able to see a beautiful reconstruction of that priory in the Irish Museum of Modern Art. Farther upstream on the Liffey, at Chapel Izard, a remarkable archaeological discovery was a watermill excavated under the direction of Clare Walsh. The mill was positioned on the weir, a small channel parallel to the main stream of the Liffey. The original mill race was about 50 meters long and 5 meters wide, cut 2 meters into the subsoil. Radiocarbon dating of the mill's final phase is late 8th to mid-9th century. Indeed, Ireland has produced some of the earliest post-Roman dates for watermills, this one being pre-Viking. And here you can see a reconstruction by Colin Rinn, who has done wonderful work on the industrial archaeology of Cork, for example. It shows how such mills worked. That you can see the mill wheel, the big gear meshing with the smaller gear there on a vertical shaft, turning the upper millstone, and the hopper contains the grain that is ground by the mill. We move now forward in time to about 1000 AD. It has normally been supposed that Vikings from Norway set up a longfoot or ship harbour at Dublin in 841. From a Viking perspective, a vital attraction at Dublin would have been the tidal pool in the River Poddle. The Dublin Garden has never been excavated archaeologically, that is the bulk of it, but the probability is that remains of ships and shipbuilding lie underground there. And indeed, in a recent excavation at Great Ship Street, Alan Hayden found some ship remains. That's on the western side of the pool. What we do have also are 4 poorly preserved pagan graves on the south side of the pool, with early radiocarbon dates of uncertain significance. The annals imply that a second longfoot was established soon afterwards, probably on the more defensible ridgetop site north of the pool in the Castle Street and Lord Edward Street area. Late 9th century buildings and other features have been found in Lindsay Simpson's excavation at Essex Street West, about there. Possibly this was the location of international trading associated with Vikings. In 944 AD, the annals refer for the first time to the Dune or stronghold of Dublin, reflecting the earth and timber defences that have been found archaeologically. The Norsemen left another marker behind them in the river name Stein, from Old Norse stein, meaning stone. The stone in question seems to have been a territorial marker in the form of a tall megalith erected on a sandbar in the bay, which survived down to the early 18th century. The fact that they called their settlement Dublin, from Dublin, ensured that the international name for the city would commemorate the pool in the Poddle rather than the ford across the Liffey. By about the year 1000 AD, the first bridge may have been constructed across the Liffey, taking the form of a wooden structure positioned over the main stream between causeways erected on the mudflats from both banks. There is no certainty about this, but a later literary text describing the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 may feature such a bridge. Here we have now an artist's impression of Dublin about the year 1000 looking north. This was based on content provided by Patrick Wallace, who directed most of the Wood Quay excavations. It shows the dual functions of Dublin's principal rivers. The Liffey side was where international trading took place, probably with the aid of wooden jetties. The sheltered pool in the Poddle was an ideal location for the fleet of warships. An impressive number of Viking Age houses have been excavated, but there is no sign yet of the royal compound occupied by kings of Dublin and their entourage from the year 853 onwards. A distinct probability is that it was located on the northern side of the pool, where the Anglo-Norman castle was erected later on. We move forward now to about 1170 AD. Viking Dublin grew into Hiberno Norse Dublin during the 10th century. In the 11th century, the original dune was extended westwards, perhaps in association with the foundation of Christchurch Cathedral in about 1030, and in order to secure the southern bridgehead. A Scandinavian relic appears to have been St. Olaf's Church in Fishamble Street, just there, commemorating a king of Norway who was killed in battle in 1031 and who came to be regarded as a martyr to the cause of converting his people to Christianity. Its position near the waterfront suggests that it was frequented by sailors and traders plying the northern seas. One effect of the causeways leading to the bridge may have been a gradual silting up of the river Liffey. By this date too, there was probably a fording place across the Poddles estuary outside the East Gate. We know there was a gate there. One purpose of this was to facilitate access to the open-air assembly place or thingmote, which we know survived as a mound down to the late 17th century. Even as late as 1364, what we call Dame Street was known as Tengmouth Street, that is Thingmount Street. By 1170, however, the leading inhabitants appear to have been meeting inside a building, itself located inside the stone walls of about 1100. Moving forward again to about 1300. In September 1170, Dublin was captured by the combined forces of Diarmaid MacMurrough, the restored King of Leinster, and an Anglo-Norman army. An attempt to counter this by the High King, Rory O'Connor, in the summer of 1171, was foiled when he and his men were caught bathing in the river Liffey and put to flight. It seems to me that this is one of the great what-ifs of Irish history. If Rory O'Connor and his huge army had taken the trouble to capture Dublin, how different would Irish history be? As in the case of all 5 Hiberno Norse towns in Ireland, the Anglo-Normans had a big impact. For example, the bridge across the Liffey was rebuilt in stone in about 1215. The Liffey was the main venue for international trading. A clause in Dublin's Charter of Urban Liberties, dating from 1192, said that the Lord John, the future King of England, was entitled to a wine levy of 2 butts per ship, to be selected by his bailiff, one before and one behind the single mast. France was probably the main source of wine, and John, like most members of the aristocracy, was a speaker of French. The Liffey may have continued to silt up to judge by the positioning of Holy Trinity Friary, an Augustinian house founded by 1282. More certainly, land was reclaimed progressively at Wood Quay and probably Merchant's Quay, reaching the modern line at the former about 1260. The prime motive for this was probably to provide deeper berthage for the larger trading ships of the 13th century. One of the finds at Wood Quay was a mast crutch, a supporting timber for the mast. It may be significant too that the street immediately outside the older or inner city wall was and still is called Cook Street. Just there. Bakers and cooks had ovens for hot food, a serious danger in a world of timber buildings. The extramural location was both outside the main town and adjacent to the Liffey, as a ready source for extinguishing out-of-control fires. There is also archaeological evidence for a quayside on the northern bank and for a minuscule harbour in the northwestern angle of the extended defensive wall on the opposite side. This may have been a ferrying point or fishing station. Wood Quay, incidentally, was so called on account of the importation of heavy timbers for new-style half-timbered houses. Blind Quay was so called because of the continuous defensive wall behind it. Another reminder of the open sea was situated on the Staine, an area of pasture and marsh. This was reputedly the location of St. James's Hospital, a hospice founded in about 1216 for pilgrims heading for the shrine of Compostela in Galicia, northwestern Spain. Here, travellers would wait for ships and for suitable weather before setting out, as well as rest on their safe return to Ireland. Equally dramatically, by about 1300, the River Puddle had been reconfigured in three ways. First, it had been dammed outside Dam Gate, thereby obstructing the natural tidal flow and causing the pool to be reduced to an elongated backwater. Note the Church of Mary del Dam, whose parish consisted mainly of the castle. Secondly, the puddle had been redirected along both sides of Patrick Street and in front of the south wall, as well as filling the rock-cut moat of the castle. A drawbridge across the moat gave access to the castle's courtyard. And thirdly, the eastern branch of the River Puddle upstream had become an underground channel to facilitate the construction of St. Patrick's Cathedral, dedicated on St. Patrick's Day, 1254. Note the pool near the suburban marketplace at the northern end of New Street. New Street, by the way, is a 13th century name. A number of watermills were installed along the course of the puddle, grinding grain for an estimated population of about 11,000. There was another mill on the River Staine. Most of these mills belonged to great lords, lay and ecclesiastical. And in James's Street, a cistern had been built to supply the city aqueduct that flowed along the ridgetop, reaching the castle about 1245. I'll explain about the cistern in a minute. But first, on the western channel of the puddle in Patrick Street, Claire Walsh found the remains of another watermill. These consisted of oak base plates and the mill race, whose wheel was estimated at about 2 to 3 meters in diameter. In later times, it was known as Ford's Mill, having been rebuilt in the late 14th century. It remained in use until the 17th century. Medieval mills were capable of powering industrial machinery as well, for example, for the fulling of cloth, but no details are available at present. And now for the city watercourse. The cistern in James's Street was fed by a sophisticated combination of the waters of the Puddle and the Dodder. The Puddle was diverted by the monks of St. Thomas's Abbey so that it passed along the southern boundary of their precinct to power a watermill. The flow of the river was reinforced by means of a canal leaving the Dodder at Balrothery, where the weir can still be seen in Dodder Valley Park, near junction 11 of the M50. If you want to see a very fine example of medieval civil engineering, go and have a look at that. By the 1240s, an agreement was reached between the monks and the city authorities, whereby the city watercourse was diverted at the Tongue in Kimmage, which is still there if you know where to look. The water was divided 2/3 to the monks and 1/3 to the citizens. This canal, running between grassy embankments, went via Dolphin's Barn to the cistern and thence to the aqueduct. The entire system depended on gravity flow, since there were no pumps. From the mid-13th century, Dubliners living inside the city walls were drinking a combination of Dodder water and puddle water, most people accessing it from fountains positioned at intervals along the course of the city aqueduct. Another piece of medieval sophistication was a private pipe leading from the aqueduct across the bridge to the Dominican house of St. Saviour on the north bank of the Liffey. We happen to know that this was a 5-inch pipe as far as the boundary of the monastic precinct, from which it was reduced to the diameter of a man's little finger. A secular beneficiary was Henry the Marshal, the mayor of Dublin in 1279 to 1280, whose water pipe had the diameter of a goose quill, and whose annual rent for this privilege was literally picturesque, a bunch of roses presented to the current mayor every 24th of June. A medieval example of poor town planning relates to the pillory, first mentioned in 1260, which was used to chastise people for minor misdemeanors, including ones of a sexual nature. This was at the top of Wilbur Street. In late Tudor times, there were complaints that missiles thrown at the occupant were polluting the water supply in Castle Street. An officer who appears to have had a ceremonial function called the bannerman was also charged with maintenance of the aqueduct. Parts of the system were fitted with leaden covers, that's inside the walls, but elsewhere pollution by animals was a constant problem. The bannerman himself was at risk of being fined as an incentive to be vigilant by seizing animals grazing there until their owners paid a fine. He himself was allowed to let his horses graze there. A levy of 1 penny per shop and 2 pence per haul provided an income for the bannerman. If the banks of the city watercourse leading to the system are washed away, the mayor and 2 bailiffs, that is to say the city's top officials, would organise a working party to undertake repairs. Cutting off the water supply was a weapon of war used by Silken Thomas in his revolt of 1534. We might view that as being comparable with Mr. Putin turning off the gas to Central and Western Europe. 4 years later, residents of Thomas Street had to be banned from washing their clothes, tripes and puddings in the city watercourse on pain of a fine for 12 pence for each offence. A major industrial use for the water was for brewing, which seems to have been a cottage industry run by women, whom we might call alewives. Women brewers of inferior ale were fined 15 pence for a first offence, 2 shillings and 6pence for a second offence, and thereafter suspension from their occupation for a year and a day. In 1455, the city council ordered them to sell ale only in officially approved measures, ranging from pints to gallons. A gallon contained 8 pints. An extended system of fines were imposed for failure to do so, starting at 12 pence. Women, however, were forbidden to sell wine because wine importation and sale was the province of vintners, who were men, high-status men, some of whom became mayors of Dublin. In 1481, the city authorities declared that tapsters and tapsteresses serving ale in an inn should do so only to persons, and I quote, of good conversation and English born, unquote. That's because in the 15th century, the inhabitants were getting worried about the threat from the Gaelic Irish. Centuries later, on the last day of the year 1759, Arthur Guinness obtained the lease of an existing brewery at St. James's Gate. This stood on the site of the medieval cistern. The water supply was still the medieval one, and Guinness, the drink, was long a product of the Dodder Poddle system. Here now we have a reconstruction of Dublin, the end of the Middle Ages, about 1500. This scale model of the late medieval city can be seen in Dublinia. Inevitably, it contains a lot of educated guesswork, or at least I hope it was educated. For example, the appearance of the Saviour's Priory that I've just mentioned up at the top there. The model maker was Dan O'Brien, who made it on the floor of the large foyer of his period house near Mallow in County Cork. Indeed, I used to get the 7 o'clock train to Cork, get off at Mallow, be met by Dan, and we went to his house to build the model. By the end of the Middle Ages, about 1500, Dublin, like countless other European towns, had suffered severe depopulation. The suburbs in particular would have been reduced, though some of the people living there appear to have been Gaelic. A smaller number of watermills would have been needed. Thus the Stain Mill outside the precinct of All Saints Priory is last mentioned in 1462. The main quays at Wood Quay and Merchants Quay were protected by defensive walls with gaps, as you can see on the model, probably as a result of the threatened siege by a Scottish army during the Bruce invasion of 1317. The gaps were left, presumably, to facilitate the loading and unloading of ships. At the eastern end of Merchants Quay, there was a crane and crane house for handling heavy goods, such as wine casks, mainly from France, millstones, probably from Germany, iron ore from northern Spain, and barrels of pitch and resin from the Baltic countries. Specially appointed porters took charge of this work, along with maintenance of the hoisting rope. Failure to keep the rope in good condition would cost them a fine of 6 shillings and 8p and loss of office. The bridge over the Liffey had a chapel dedicated to St. Mary, for which permission had been granted in 1348, the year when plague first struck the city. The river itself was regarded as a valuable salmon fishery, hence tanners and glovers were banned from washing their leather in it, causing pollution, on pain of a fine of 3 shillings and 4p. The puddle can be seen on the model dammed with 2 watermills, and then the original Dublin, a mere remnant, but not built on. Here we have a coloured version of John Speed's famous map of 1610. This is the first map to survive now of Dublin. Cork and Limerick, for example, have earlier maps than this. The Dublin map may have been drafted in about 1604, was engraved in Amsterdam in 1610, and published in the grandly titled The Theatre of the Empire of Great Britain in 1612. A century later than the scale models date, therefore, the main change had been the closure of the monasteries and hospitals in about 1540. Many survived in part, given over to secular uses. For example, number 2 is St. Mary's Abbey, used as a musician's store. Number 3, St. Saviour's Priory, as the Inns of Court, where the 4 courts are now. Number 12, Trinity College, used then as a university. Number 58, St. Thomas Court, was a high status residence. The River Liffey was still the city's lifeblood, with 3-masted ocean-going ships, as you can see on the map, despite problems with sandbars in the bay. The river was still essentially shallow, for back in 1466, the Augustinian friars had been ordered to block off access to a ford near their premises because of the danger to horse riders endeavouring to cross over at that point, including at night time. Would have been about there. The Poddle still had some of its watermills, the mill wheel of Pool Mill being visible if you look very closely at the map. And note the pool at the southern end of New Street that I've mentioned before, if you just about see it down there. On the northern bank of the Liffey, the estuary of the River Bradogue was associated with the former monks' fishing harbour known as the Pill. A small detail on Speed's map is the apparent absence of some buildings at the bottom of Wine Tavern Street. We can guess the reason. Back in 1597, about 24,000 pounds of gunpowder had been brought to the crane for unloading and carriage to the castle. Sparks caused by the rolling of firkins, that is small barrels, or by a restless horse may have ignited some spilt powder. In the event, there was a massive explosion, totally destroying 20 houses, according to one witness, and killing a large number of people. Nevertheless, one contemporary took comfort from the fact that few of the people who were killed were English, nor of any account, as he says, apart from the master of a ship from Chester. In other words, much local labour in late Elizabethan Dublin would have been Irish, and it would seem socially inferior, if not merely expendable. Now for a nice surprise. This grove of trees at that complicated junction, Kevin Street, Dean Street, New Street, and Patrick Street. This grove of trees is probably on the site of the residual pool in the River Puddle. And the message here is that everything in an urban streetscape means something. The trick is to know what it means. Another sign of the puddle, culverted in the city centre, can be seen from Ormond Quay Lower in the direction of Wellington Quay, the outlet pipe through which it still flows. And finally, I'd like to show you this front cover of a pocket map of medieval Dublin, which is a derivative of the fascicle that I mentioned at the start. If you wish to discover other visible remains of medieval Dublin, go to the Royal Irish Academy, number 19 Dawson Street, that's the Georgian building next to the Mansion House, and purchase this pocket map. It takes the form of a large-scale map with all known medieval features down to circa 1540, superimposed in colour on a modern Ordnance Survey base map. There is a classified list of medieval sites and a short historical survey. And note too, by the way, the cover of this book that I mentioned later on. Take the map, say to Christchurch Cathedral, and look for buildings such as the Ordnance Church, a section of the city wall in Cook Street, and a large number of street names. Choose a day that is not wet and windy. The map is quite big and will blow around in a strong wind. You will be amazed by how much of the city's medieval heritage is still traceable. Back to you, Ruth.
Well, thank you so much, Howard, for that absolutely fascinating description of how the Liffey and its tributaries really are the lifeblood of the medieval town and city of Dublin as it developed over time. I think I've been in a privileged position to be able to see many of the sites that you've discussed under excavation. And I think it's just really extraordinary how you are able to weave evidence such as place names, analysis of maps, historical documents and archaeological evidence to kind of really bring these things to life, because many of the rivers are now either canalized or are underground and not visible, but they're still there, pulsing beneath the city street. So without further ado, I'd just like to ask you if you could recommend to our viewers some other places to go and resources that they might look up if they would like to know more about medieval Dublin and its rivers.
Well, I suggested the pocket map, of course, and another place to go is Dublinia to see the exhibition there, and that creates a possibility of purchasing 2 books there that are available at a very good price. These books are called Dublin and the Viking World, published in 2018, and Dublin, the Making of the Medieval City in 2019. And both of these books were published by the O'Brien Press, and they're beautifully illustrated. And I'd like to take this opportunity to mention the sad news of a week or so ago of the death of Michael O'Brien. Like Michael Adams of the Four Courts Press, Michael O'Brien of the O'Brien Press was one of those visionaries in the publishing world. And both of those companies have published over the years, over decades now, many books about the heritage of this country, including Dublin itself. So these books were co-authored by yourself, Ruth, by successive education officers at Dublinia, that is to say, Sarah Dent and Sheila Dooley and myself. So I think that's one thing you can do is go to Dublinia, enjoy the exhibition there. It's recently improved in a number of ways. Buy the books, look at the cathedral, including its crypt next door to Dublinia, and then with your map, walk the streets of the medieval core of the city. It seems to me that you will be richly rewarded in a cultural sense. Make a family day out.
Thank you, Howard. I would second those kind words about Michael, and also highly recommend that people do go to Dublinia. It's a fantastic resource run by the Medieval Trust. In terms of the rivers, is there a particular book that you could recommend to viewers to go and look for more information about the many rivers that we've mentioned, many of which are underground?
That's right. Well, in 1988, the so-called Millennium Year, Stephen Conlin, who is a very talented art historian, and John de Courcy, they produced an illustrated book called Anna Livia, The River of Dublin. And then John de Courcy, a few years later in 1996, he produced another book, The Liffey in Dublin, which takes the form of a comprehensive dictionary of everything to do with the River Liffey. Now, sadly, both of these books are now out of print, as far as I know, but you might be able to find copies of them in a library, in your local library, if you look.
Thank you, Howard. Howard, you mentioned the reconstruction of the Kilmainham Priory, and that will soon be available. Howard has been kindly assisting Dublin City Council and project partners with that visualization by Stephen Conlin again of the Kilmainham Priory, which of course was bounded on the north, I suppose, by the River Liffey indirectly, and directly on the south by the River Camac, which runs through Kilmainham and Inchicore. So watch this space. Hopefully that will be launched in sometime in the autumn. In terms of then some of the ideas that you raised in terms of the lifeblood of the city, Howard, I think you've demonstrated brilliantly how the Liffey has been exploited in different ways over time in the Middle Ages. Firstly, with the Viking raids as a navigation system, and then for trading, also for defense and attack. So obviously the Poddle formed part of the moat of Dublin Castle, and also then the siege of Silken Thomas and the cutting off of the water supplies just really shows you how absolutely vital these water sources were. But everything from trading to fishing and milling, drinking water and water supply, ships and shipping, and even down to pilgrimage. So I have to say thank you so much for a terrific talk. And I'm going to just close now by letting our viewers know that there's a number of other talks this Heritage Week. We have What is Water Heritage on the 14th of August by Dublin City Community Groups. Industry as Water Heritage by Rob Goodbody. Obviously Howard today. Dr. Aileen O'Carroll is talking about working on the waterfront, the story of the Dublin Docker. Antoine Giacometti, an archaeologist in Dublin, is talking about the archaeology of Dublin rivers, and I think that will speak very nicely to Howard's lecture today. Lara Joy of the Dublin Port Authority is talking about the heritage of the port city. Barry Keogh is talking about Between the Liffey and the Camac, how water shaped the extraordinary heritage of the suburb of Kilmainham. And finally, last but not least, Professor Ken Whelan, Pádraig Fogarty and Mary Kelly Quinn are talking about water as natural heritage, discussing the city's aquatic flora and fauna. So I'd just like to finish by saying thank you, Howard, for a super lecture, and thanks to the Heritage Office for organising this series along with LAWPRO. Thank you.